Hello, Frank.
Hello, Jesper.
Over to you, Frank.
Thank you, Jesper. Hi, everyone. I guess you guys can still hear me. So this presentation is a bit special because I'm going to talk about layouts with Qt. The name you can see here is from a fellow worker of mine, which is Philippe Hermite, which is working for Adobe. I'm going to present him right after. And this is a presentation we created together to give kind of experience feedback around layouts with Qt, because it's not always simple, always easy, depending on what you want to do. Okay, but it will still, I hope, be interesting for you guys, and let's see how it goes. So let's present ourselves first. As I said, Philippe Hermite is a software engineer that is working at Allegorithmic, and it's Adobe company now because it's been bought, and he's maintaining Substance Painter, which is a big application using widgets. So he had quite a journey with layout issues and complex use cases around layouts that would be interesting to share. So we went together and discussed, okay, let's see the point that maybe an issue when you start using Qt and layouts and things like that. How do you deal with certain situation? And we came up with this presentation. For myself, I'm Frank Haricot. I'm a software engineer at KLab for 6 years. I have been a KDE contributor even before that, and I'm still contributing now. Okay, so that's a bit for the background. Without any further ado, let's go into the main topic. Okay, so first a disclaimer, guys. I'm gonna first say that sorry, I'm moving a bit the chat around. Okay, that everything that we're going to say here is applying for Qt 5.12. Okay, and it should mostly be true for, especially the benchmarking. But it should mostly be true for any further and recent version. But yeah, just so you know what I'm saying, we tried and we tested under 5.12. Okay. So as I said, the idea of this presentation is to give feedback of, okay, I'm using Qt for a bit now, and I'm using layouts, and I've encountered some issues while I was developing. Am I the only one? Do people know this issue or this kind of use cases that is a bit weird that I'm using together with layouts, and all this journey that my colleague Philippe Hermite has been through and talked to me with about. We basically try to make a presentation out of it, and it would then be displayed this way. Be laid this way. Why would you use a layout? Which layout would you use for each reason, and for which use case? How do you choose, basically? And some specific problematic, like how do you align different layouts one with another, or the widget within a layout, kind of sort of thing. Okay, and there will be a bit of benchmarking as well, because we encountered some specific cases where performance would matter, and then it's a nice touch to give it here and give some tips about it. So the plan will be this way. Okay, you want to use layouts and mainly to align with your widget. That will be the first point. How to align widgets within a view and widget within a layout. Okay, how to make things beautiful and nice and smooth for the user. Another topic would be how to align layout together, because it's not always easy when you have multiple layouts and multiple section within your view. Then we're gonna talk a little bit about layout operation, like inserting and removing. Okay, that's some tips and tricks that you can apply in order to smooth the user experience. And then we're gonna transition to, okay, when you start to show some views with multiple widgets and you start having more and it scales up quite a bit, how do you move away from layouts to other classes of Qt to display nicely your content? Okay. And if we have time, hopefully it should be okay. I'll show you a little bit of Gamma Ray and how you can debug and analyze layouts and be helped by Gamma Ray, which is a KLab tool that we are providing for free on GitHub. Okay, so that's the plan. Okay. So first thing first, using layouts to align your widgets, your Qt widgets. So this is like the most basic things on Earth. You want to organize your view. You want two things for that to organize your view. You want the dynamic aspect of it, meaning that when you create a view and you have it in a nice way, when you resize your window, you want everything to resize correctly, okay, and to always be relevant for your user. That's one thing. The other thing is within a given view, you want to be able to structure your UI and say, let's say, have a part of the UI being here, displaying a certain kind of information, another being a bit below, displaying some other kind of information, and you want to structure and give a clear and relevant display for the user so he can understand better your application and it feels smooth as a user experience. Okay, that's both the biggest need. Okay, most of the layouts, class layouts, well, all the layouts include in Qt inherits from QLayout. Okay, and this QLayout class provides this dynamic resizing I was talking about. So you basically have that for free as soon as you use layout. It can be tricky and special at some point, but that would be for another talk to cover. Since you have that for free, we're gonna mainly focus on the structural aspect of your views. How do you structure your view? How do you choose what goes where? How do you align things together? How do you make a nice display out of your views? Okay, so we're gonna focus on that. Since alignment may be tricky within a layout. Okay. In order to achieve that, we tried to come up with a nice, consistent example all along this talk that might not be perfect. Obviously, some part of this application you wouldn't approach as we did. You would do things different maybe, but okay, it's a toy project that allow us to show, to make rise some issues that you can have with layout, and it's kind of close to issues we had in real life on productive code, on code that goes on production code actually. Okay, so what is this example all about? Okay, if you look at here, it's a simple QMain window, basically displaying two columns with property name, property value, and potentially a button. I'm gonna get on back on that later. And the main window in Qt, you might not be all aware of it, but has properties. For instance, every big class in Qt has properties such as YZPlace with his X and his Y, the width, the height, and this kind of thing. Okay, all of these are properties that are proper to the main window, and we want to display that. It's a backend like another, but it's better than displaying some XML because it's already there, and we know perfectly how to go and reach that properties for this window. Okay, so the whole idea is to have this window and display the list of the properties, so the property name and the property value. And if the value is of an integer type, we want to be able to edit it. Okay, so simple application, simple use case, but there are different kind of approach to do that. Okay. Name of the property, value of the property, edit button when the property is on the given type. So how do you achieve this window? Okay. First approach, I don't know how simple I should start, but I'm gonna assume, guys, that you know a bit layouts, right? The few classes that there are in Qt. The key VBox layout, okay, which is doing vertical layouting from top to bottom. The horizontal one from left to right, which is inserting horizontally. And then we're gonna cover a bit more later on the grid, but I'm gonna explain it later on. Okay. So to achieve this view, what we could do is have a main vertical layout filled with, let's say, a widget with into it a horizontal layout containing first the property name, then the property value, and potentially a edit button if it's needed. Okay, that's gonna be the main approach. Okay, so let's do that. Okay, let's see the code. So I assume guys you can see my cursor. Otherwise, it will be hard, okay? So this is an example of a code that does what I'm saying to organize the view as we said. On this code, there are things, but not all the things that make the view be as it is, because I kept it simple only to focus on the organization within the layout, okay? I stripped off the noisy part that is not really relevant, okay? For instance, the header. The header here that you can see with property name, property value, it's not shown here, but it doesn't matter right now. We're going to talk about it later. For now, what we want to focus on is, okay, first there is a loop. We're gonna parse each properties of the QMain window. So first property would be object name, second would be model, and so on and so on. With each of them having a value, a main window, false, 0, true, and so on and so on. Okay. So on this line 204, we basically starting a loop around the property count, and we retrieving the property. It doesn't really matter. Let's consider this line's magic. Okay. You basically end up having the property and its value, and you can make label out of it. Label is the way to display the name here and the value here within a widget. Okay, it's simple enough. So you would have a label with the property name. You would have a label created with a magical function. Let's not care about it either, which is a value label. So you have those two labels that you want now to add into some layouting for it to work. So what would we do? We would have a widget, which is a property widget. Okay. A property layout, which would be within this widget, which would represent the row of every single line. Okay, so a row would be here, for instance, Windows modality being the first of the row, second of the row would be 0, and third of the row would be edit, the button. Okay, so that's what happened here. We have this property layout, and we add first the name label, and we add second the value label, so we have one next to the other. And if the value is of a given type, or integer in this case, you add the button, okay, with this line, property layout, add widget. So you have 3 widgets on a given row, and then you put this row into the main vertical QV box layout, as it say here, and this is done here, content layout, add widget, okay? If you do that, what would happen? You should have this nice and shiny UI, right? Well, wrong. You would have that. Issue here is that some rows have 2 widgets, the property name and the property value, and some have 3. So the property name, property value, and the button. And since the layout is basically splitting equally the size, the space for each sub widget, it's misaligning the content. In this case, this one ends up here. This one starts here because it shares equally the space, but in this case there are 3. So basically it's misaligned, and you have the 0, which is totally offsetted from the false value here, and it's just ugly. Okay. As a matter of as a proof, you can see that if I remove the button here, it's basically aligned again. So yeah, that's the issue. So yeah, first use case, if you arrive as a beginner with Qt and you try that, yeah, you end up basically not understanding really well what's happening, but that's the reason. So how do you prevent that? Well, you could use a grid. Let's explain a little bit around the grid. A grid is not an alignment horizontal or vertical. It's basically you having a grid, so a full grid with row and column. And instead of adding the widget and let the layout do the magic, you have to precise why you want this widget to be added. Okay, so you precise the row and the column. So if we get back to our code, this time I added a bit the header. So now that we are a bit more knowledgeable about the code, you can see that the header is basically a widget, a new label created on the row 0 and column 0 for the property name. Property value is added on the row 0 and on the column 1. Okay. So with that, you have your header. It could be done in another way, but we're gonna discuss that later. And then you start with the content. So we have again our magic loop, which is giving properties and value. And in this case, since we don't want to put our widgets anywhere, we basically retrieve the last row, the last position where we want to add the widget. Okay, so we have row here being the last position we want to add the widget in. Okay, we have our name label again, our value label again. Now, instead of doing as before, we add that into a grid layout by precising add widget our name label, and we precise now the row and the column. Okay, so row is the last position, the last index position available. 0 is the column 0, and row again, and 1. So we have basically aligning correctly. Okay. If you do that, and again, same thing for the button on the column 2, you end up with this, which is way better. So at the cost of a little bit less maintainable code, because you have to maintain some kind of logic with the row and the column, and it costs a little bit more, but not too much. You have a nice alignment of your widgets. Okay, that's good. So as a beginner of Qt, it's already something, right? You transition from using layout and having issues because you have some kind of specific use case, which is a given amount of widgets into your layout, a dynamic amount. You can solve that by using grid layout. We're gonna talk a bit more about performance later, but it's already something. So now that we have the right thing, let's talk a little bit about the edit function. What is this function? Okay, the idea about the edit function is that when you click on the edit button, the value, the property value, is replaced with an editor, in this case a Spinbox, because it makes sense, and the user can change the value and commit it by clicking again on the button. Okay, so that's the main goal. So at the same time, you have kind of two states: one, the edit state, and then the regular displaying state. And the property value column is not displaying the same thing depending on which state you are in. Okay, so only one of those widgets is visible at a time. So how would you implement that? Well, let's imagine that we have our old code, this one. Okay. Oops, sorry. Let's imagine this code and that we have some kind of magical code that make it align again. Okay. How would you then have this logic, have this working, have the fact that when you click on a commit button, you switch the content of the second column, and when you click back again, you have the label showing again. Well, remember we had a edge box layout containing a label, and a button. Instead of that, now we're gonna have a label, another layout containing potentially containing always the property value and the editor if the value is editable, and we're gonna show only one of those two at the same time, not both together. Okay, and on the third part of this whole QHBox layout, we're gonna have the button again. Okay. So basically, we're gonna have a new sub layout containing the value and the editor. Okay, so this was the code that we had before. Let's upgrade it to this version. Okay, we are in the loop. We just in the property layout, we just added the name label, and now instead of adding the value, we create a new layout. This layout right now is a QVBox layout called value and editor layout. Okay, we created it. We get back our value label and we add it into this sub layout. Okay, this sub layout is then added into the property layout, the one from before, this one here. Okay, so again, we have our HBox layout, our property layout. First element is a name label. Second is a sub layout, and this sub layout so far is filled with only one value label. If we arrive in this if statement, we see that we are creating a Spinbox. That's the editor we needed. We set the right value into it, and then we put that into the value and editor layout, which is our sub layout. Okay. By default, it will not be visible. It makes sense. So now what we have is our horizontal layout with the name label, first, the sub layout with the value label and the editor. And now, if we want the whole thing to be complete, we need to add the button, which is done here, edit button, a push button, and we add it to the layout. Okay. What's missing now? We are missing the fact that we hide the value and show the editor when we are in edition mode, and we show the value and we hide the editor when we are in standard display. Okay. So as most of the dynamic things in Qt, you do that through signal and slot. I hope you guys are all familiar with that. we are able to do that here again. Okay, so we are connecting a lambda. I'm going to explain that a bit later on the edit button. So when the edit button is clicked, this code here is called. Okay, it's a lambda. It's a function that is created on place, but it could totally be a slot, a regular slot that you guys use every day, defined somewhere else. Okay. And what is this code doing? When the button is clicked, it passes its state. Is it checked or not? Okay. And depending on if it's checked, we're doing a thing or another. Okay. If it's checked, then we are entering in the editor mode, and the editor would be visible, and the value label would be hidden, and vice versa. Okay. So that's the logic to switch and have only one visible at a time. Okay, we noted that our sub layout is a QV box layout, but it actually doesn't matter. That's what this bullet is saying here. Since only one of them is displayed at a time, the fact that it's aligned horizontally or vertically doesn't really matter, since yes, there is only one. So good. If we do that, we're gonna have an issue, which is basically a flickering issue. Let me show you that in a few seconds by doing this. Okay, that's me uploading a video in a quick way. Okay, the result is here. We have a correct alignment, and now if I'm clicking on the edit, you can see the editor is appearing. Now let's say I'm spamming it and check specifically for the 0 above the spin box. You see it's moving, it's flickering because the height of the spin box and the height of the label isn't exactly the same. And then it's basically changing heights and creating some weird feeling for the user. Okay, that seems stupid, but it's this kind of thing that matter for the user as a whole. Okay. Okay. So how could we fix that? The answer went super fast on the screen and disappeared. We could actually use a layout called a QStack layout, which is mostly used for tab management, but we can use some benefits of it. A QStack layout is a layout that can contain multiple widgets, and you can say which one is visible, is the one currently used, and it would hide the rest. But the benefit of it is that the height of this layout is the height of its bigger widget within it, okay? Or its bigger sub-widget, so to say. Okay, so let's see the code on how it would look like. Let's get back on the grid solutions that we had. So remember, we have our grid code, which was here. Okay, so we had the loop, we had the grid, and we added at the correct row and column the right widget. Okay. So same code, but this time we are using a QStack layout. So as I said, it stacks several widgets, and you choose which one is the one being displayed at a time, and the size would be one of the biggest widgets. So no issue of flickering anymore. Okay, so we are within the loop. We drive the position of the row we want to insert the item. We have our name label. We insert the name label at the row and column 0. Okay, and this time we have our stack widget instead of the VBox widget layout from before. So QStack layout. We created one. We had the value label. Okay, this layout is a sub layout of the content grid layout as before. No, nothing is new. And since this stack layout is only having the value label now, we add the editor. So the editor is created here. We set the value and we put it into it. Okay, and then we have the button logic that is the same as before. Okay, but now the dynamic aspect of the code has a little bit changed, right? Before we used set visible false and true on the widget which was within the layout. Now we have a proper API to do that, which is value and editor layout set current widget. This define which widget will be displayed and the rest would not be displayed. Okay, so again we connect to the button. When it's checked, we when we clicked, we execute this lambda, and this lambda is making sure that when it's checked, basically the editor is shown, and when it's not checked, basically the value label is shown only. Okay. And this would provide you a perfect alignment because you are using the grid and it works. And it would prevent flickering, so which is a nice thing. So that seems like little detail, but yeah, that's what makes the difference between an application and another. So to conclude this first section, we can see that grid layout is more reliable than Qbox layout when it's about aligning dynamic amount of object into it, and even so, but there is a price for it, which is the maintainability of the code, because now you're not just doing add widget, you're doing you have to precise the row and the column, and if some of your colleague is arriving on your code and changing everything and not taking much care of what you did before, it can mess up the code. But yeah, that's the price to pay for power and responsibility, as you guys say. Okay. And stack layout can solve the flickering issue that we've seen, but we're gonna see a bit later on that it can be a bit tricky because layouting using Qt stack layout and grid layout can have some nice performance issues that we're gonna see in a few seconds. Okay, so that's the benchmarking we did. So let's first start with 10 rows. Okay, so imagine that we have our main window and we have just 10 rows of properties to display. Okay, on the first line you have Qbox layout used with an editor, without editor. Sorry, so basically just the row display that we are doing. You can see that using Qbox layout or Qgrid layout doesn't matter much. It's super close. When we use the editor in a Qbox layout, well, it's basically the same. Okay, you remember the sub layout created with a Qbox layout, which was a QVBox layout actually. Doesn't matter much. It's kind of close. But if we look at the editor using a QStack layout, editor using a QStack layout within a Qbox layout, it's still the same level of speed, but it starts to be a bit different for using Qgrid layout. So we wanted to know a bit more about that because 10 rows is not so much. What happens if we put 20, 30, 40? Then we just run with 100 rows. And with 100 rows, we have some weird issues that QStack layout and Qgrid layout would actually took almost a second to actually display what should be super fast comparing to the rest of the solutions. With a bit of profiling, we realize that QStack layout is basically having some code in the set current item function that is trying to handle some focus aspect of focus transmission, basically. And in order to do so, it basically goes to the parent of the layout. So in our case, since we were in a grid layout, which is the main layout, it would go for the main widget of the whole main window. And then it would pass all the children to have some nice focus logic and give the focus to the right person in a nice way. But since you have 100 rows, it basically started to parse again the whole tree, object tree, and taking a lot of time for actually nothing, which would really hurt. So yeah, that's one of our experience feedback that we wanted to give. It can be tricky to use QStack layout within a grid layout for this reason. So yeah, just not nice to know, I guess. Okay. So we've seen two use cases mostly: having a dynamic amount of widget into a row, and being able to hide and show a widget within a layout, and the overall idea of aligning widget with one another around this. Okay, okay, that's one thing. Now the other thing you can have as an issue or thing you want to tackle is how to align different layouts. So what do I mean by that? In our current example, we have the header here, which is basically, as we've seen in the code of the grid, the first row of our grid layout. Okay, the first row of the grid layout is the header, but if it's done this way, when I'm scrolling the scroll area here, I would have the content getting up, and the header not displaying anymore, which is not nice. I would like the header to remain visible while I'm scrolling around the application. Okay. That's the new feature we want to develop. So let's make our little project evolve. And how should we do that? Well, the first thing is you want to have this header in another layout. Basically, you want it on another layout. But if you do that, the issue that you will encounter first is that since it's in another layout and the content of your grid layout being dynamic, you need the width of your content to always match the one of your header. Otherwise, it would be misaligned and it would basically not be nice for your user. So a first naive solution, but which is working, would be to use hard-coded value. So how would you do that? So you would make sure that your header layout is having a given proper width, and you would set a hard-coded value for your grid, for your content grid, basically, to match this header width. Okay, it works basically. It works if the content of your grid is not dynamic. That's totally fine. If you know and you have the knowledge of what would be displayed and how and what is length, you can go for this solution. But if the content of the grid layout is generated dynamically, like in our case, because we don't know which property will be displayed, or if let's say you pass some XML and the content can be really different from one to another, then you don't know, and you can have content that is not fitting the hard-coded value you set. So in this case, you cannot actually go for this solution. So what could you do? Well, you could do a little trick, which would be to let the layout do its magic first, which is basically letting it be being displayed and calculate for you the correct size, the correct width, to make sure that the content is being displayed nicely, because that's what a layout is doing. And once it's done, you basically capture this value, this correct width that it's been calculated, and you set it as a minimum value. That's what the code is doing here through a timer, for instance. That's just example code, where basically you make sure that at the initialization of your layout, you call this function, which is basically setting the current width of a given cell as the minimum width. Okay, that could work. Why is that so complex? Why is that so painful to not be able to say that we want things to adapt? It's because basically layouts has no signal. The QBox layout has no signal to notify you that an item has been added or removed. So if you're adding or removing item from your layout, you cannot be notified, and you cannot adapt the width of your header with the content to make sure they match. So yeah, there is no ideal solution for that, basically. So that's one thing to know. There is no ideal solution, but we're gonna see some stuff later on to kind of make better for it. Okay. Yeah, because you cannot really predict. Well, you have to predict or run this code again and again each time you insert or remove, and it starts to be a pain to maintain, basically. Okay. I'm talking about removing and inserting widgets from layout. So yeah, it's a nice moment to talk about layout operation. Yeah, some operation takes time. Inserting a widget into a layout can take a bit of time. So if within the workflow of your application, because it's doing an update, basically, you're adding a widget into the layout, it's doing an update, and then that calls a lot of function, like the polish function of the widgets for each widget, and then yeah, it triggers. It has consequences, and yeah, if you want to make it smooth for the user, maybe you can try to dispatch the insertion in several steps, basically. The trick you can do for removal, though, would be that if you remove 10, let's say 10 widgets let's say you have a clear or filter button on your UI, okay, and this button would clear 10 widgets of your layout. If the user is supposed to expect 10 buttons to be removed, what you can do in order to avoid an update in between every single removal would be to disable the layout, do your remove, and then enable it again. So you would pay only the price of one update and one polish per widget. That is actually an optimization that you can do to make sure that you're not wasting time and creating bottlenecks. Okay. I'm gonna move away from that for now and maybe get back on it later. Okay. So we've seen issues with alignments of widgets within the layout. The tricky case of showing and hiding widgets into it, and the idea of how do you align layouts with one with another. Now let's speak a bit and transition for the case when you have more widgets, because as we've seen already, for 10 rows it's fine, but when we started with 100 rows, you cannot actually maintain that with layout. It doesn't make so much sense, okay? And especially if you're using stacked layout with a grid layout, where we've seen the performance was just terrible. So you can actually layout without layouts. That's a nice trick. Basically, in Qt, there is this whole model view module, which is made and designed specifically to display a lot of information in a performant, clear, and nice way. Okay, it offers a nice API, and it's actually very, very powerful. So you guys should be interested when you start having scaling up your views, when you have a lot of things to display. So what are those views? Those views, they are the one listed here. So mostly QList view, Qtree view, and Qtable view. So those are called basically item views, and are here to make sure that you can display properly your UI. They're getting fed by a QAbstract item model as an entry point. We'll see a bit about that later on. But basically, you have a view, you provide a model, and the view is then able to provide the data of the model. Okay. And the nice thing about it is that it's not using layouts within the code. It's basically drawing each cell manually, and it does that pretty well and in a performant way, and give you some benefits that we're going to see right now. Okay. So in our project, the project where we've seen in our example project, basically what we're seeing is a 2-column widget, maybe with a third column, displaying 2 labels, and there is no depth. It's only a one level depth, and it's not just a list. It should be seen as a table, right? So in our case, the view that we might want to select for this to suit this display would be the Qtable view. Okay. As I said, we need to feed the view with a model. Since I don't have so much time to explain to you the whole thing about model view, we're gonna use a built-in model, which is a QStandard item model, which is basically a model that you can feed with standard item. And the thing you put in the standard item, depending the role, we're gonna see in a few seconds, is going to be displayed. Okay. So let's see right now what the code would look like. We have a QStandard item model being created here. Okay. We have our magic loop that is parsing the property. And what we're doing here is that we're creating an item which contains the property name. We're creating another item which contains the property value in here, because we put the value here as a data, and it would be the data displayed. Okay. Let's ignore the row right now. And we make it editable. Okay. Then in the model, we said we append the row, and we basically append a list of item. The first one being the property name, the second one being the property value. Okay. If we do that, we make sure that, let's say for the 30th item, if it's the property name is mouse tracking and the value is false, it's encapsulated into items and then put into the model. Then you put the model into the view. with this line UI table view set model, and then it's nicely displaying the content of the model. If you do that, you have another benefit, which is that you can use the set header data API, where you say that on column 0 and column 1 you would have this and this header, the property name and property value header, and then when you scroll, this would follow and always remain visible and work nicely. Okay, so that's how you would do. Okay, one issue that you might have with Qt table view is that it does not, as the layout does, fill the whole space. Okay, to fill the whole space, you can use a piece of API where you can say that, for instance, the last section, for instance, this one, that should hit the whole space if the window is being maximized, for instance. Then you can do that by calling stretch last section and give a true or false. But you can even do that for any column by using the set section resize mode and put any given the stretch value here or the non-stretch value here, actually. And note that the Qt view is doing that by default. Okay. And if we do that, we basically have a nice thing. You can see that the editor is displaying correctly. The alignment is perfect. The header is perfect as well, is following. And we have even the editor into it and no more edit button. Okay, which is nice. And if we compare with the rest, if you have 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 elements to display, you can see that grid layout is definitely not the class you want to use. First, because it would be horrible code-wise to use. But since it's in a loop, it seems doable and everything, but yeah, it's just not made for that. And that table view and tree view is doing a much better job. Okay. And here is this little subtlety here is that tree view can take a little bit more of display, because basically, since the heights of the children of a tree view can be different from one to another, it would pre-calculate the height of every single child of the tree, and even though it doesn't have to be on screen, so that's a bit annoying. But in order to prevent yourself from that, you just have to precise that you want this row height to be uniform, that it is uniform. You set that to true, and then it will stop doing that, and you end up with only this value. Okay, which is super nice and super fast. So conclusion, layouts are not ideal solution when displaying a lot of Qt widgets. Yeah, definitely. You should definitely go for, as you've seen, performance is already a reason to avoid that. And yeah, you need to know a little bit more about models, but I strongly encourage you to use models and to know about models using Qt. And in this case, we use custom item models, but it's more a prototyping class because it's basically copying the object, the data into it, which you want to avoid. You want to avoid copy of all your data. But yeah, just as a start, it's a good class to prototype and then move to a better implementation of your model. Even though it requires a bit more code, and sometimes the little trick is that if you want to custom your view and have it being displayed in a different way, you need to re-implement a delegate. So that costs a bit more as well. You have a little bit more power with the layout, but it's not that complex. And actually, you really need to learn about model view. So model view and delegate are quite important in Qt, and you should definitely take a bit of time to take care of it. That's all for the presentation.
Okay. So over to questions. We had a question from Andre, who is talking about remember you were showing us the stacked layout and
yeah.
For anything there, and you showed us that it was taking a lot of time because of that it was setting up the focus handling. So his question is: Are there no way of disabling that? Could you, for example, set up the focus path yourself and that way bypass that code?
Not that I'm aware of, because you cannot. As soon as you call the code that I've read about this issue, I didn't try, but it didn't seem possible to bypass that. What you could try is no, actually, you would need to go for the QBox layout and the QStack layout together, and making sure you have a widget on top, which is not the main widget, So when you do that, when you do the set current item, you would remain on a level with 3 different sub widgets and nothing more. So you don't spend your whole time parsing them, and it will go way faster. Maybe that could actually be a nice topic for an investigation to see if we can bypass that. But so currently, I didn't find any solution against that.
Okay, fair enough. There's a question from somebody calling himself JH. Is there any way to have the layout that resizes himself if the contents? Sorry, is there any way to have a layout that resizes its content to fit the width and height? I guess much like an Angular layout in QML.
Yeah. Okay. That's actually when I said that we wouldn't cover the aspect of the resizing, it's because there are ways to do that. It depends if you are an author or a consumer of an existing widget. But basically, what you could do is define the policy of your widgets to say, hey, when I'm within the layout and the layout is basically getting bigger, here is the amount of space I want to take, and those would be defined through policies, which I couldn't actually cover in this talk. But yeah, that's where you would actually go. You would dig. And this other sizing aspect, if you are an author of a widget, you can actually re-implement this function and provide yourself the actual size that you want to have and how much space you want to eat as a widget.
Okay. And Frank, thank you very much for joining us, and see you later.
Okay, thank you very much, Jesper. See you later. Bye-bye.
Bye.